There are people for whom this time of year feels quietly uncomfortable in a way that's hard to explain without sounding ungrateful or bitter, not devastated or falling apart, just aware that something about the season doesn't fit. And if that's been your experience, and if you find yourself moving through these days feeling slightly out of step, it's important to say this clearly at the beginning. There is nothing wrong with you for feeling that way. For some, this season lands easily. For others, it doesn't, and the difference isn't attitude, effort, or emotional maturity. It's circumstance. Who is near? Who is far away? Who is gathered elsewhere? And when you are the one not being gathered, this period can feel isolating in a way that doesn't show up during the rest of the year. You might not feel deeply sad, you might not even feel upset. But there can be a low-grade loneliness that sits just beneath the surface, a sense of watching rather than participating, of being adjacent to something that everyone else seems to be inside of, and that feeling can be confusing, especially if your life, overall, is stable, functional, and full in other ways. What makes this harder is that the season doesn't leave much room for neutrality. It carries a strong emotional tone, togetherness, family, shared tables, familiar rituals. And when those things aren't part of your immediate reality, not because of conflict or choice, but because of distance or timing, the absence becomes more noticeable than it usually would. At other times of the year, being alone doesn't necessarily mean being lonely. Independence can feel normal. Quiet can feel restorative. Space can feel earned. But during this period, absence gets framed differently. It's no longer just circumstance, it starts to feel like a comparison. You look around at images, conversations, plans being made, and it becomes clear that many people are spending this time surrounded by others. And even if you're genuinely happy for them, even if you don't resent their experience, it can still stir something uncomfortable, a sense of being on the outside of a moment that's being presented as universal. This is where the discomfort often turns inward, not dramatically but subtly. You might catch yourself wondering why this time of year bothers you so much, why you don't look forward to it, why it feels performative to participate when the experience being celebrated isn't actually yours. And because the season is framed as meaningful, that discomfort can start to feel personal. It's easy to assume that disliking this time of year says something about you, that it reflects a lack of gratitude or openness or emotional warmth. But that assumption skips over something obvious and important. You're not rejecting the idea of connection. You're reacting to the contrast between what's being emphasized and what's actually present in your life right now. There's a difference between choosing solitude and having it assigned by circumstance, and there's a difference between being content alone and being reminded, repeatedly, that others are together while you are not. That reminder doesn't have to crush you to still be tiring. It doesn't have to overwhelm you to still matter. For many people in this position, the hardest part isn't the loneliness itself, it's the feeling that they're supposed to respond differently, that they should enjoy the season anyway, that they should rise above it, that they should find meaning in it. And when that response doesn't come naturally, it can feel like a quiet failure. But this reaction isn't a personal shortcoming. It's a natural response to a season that amplifies togetherness while offering few alternatives for those whose lives don't align with that narrative in this moment. You can dislike the season without disliking your life. You can acknowledge what you don't have right now without believing it defines you. None of that requires explanation or correction. This is not about fixing how you feel, and it's not about reframing your circumstances. It's about naming the experience accurately so you don't mistake it for something it isn't. Because feeling this way at this time does not mean you are lacking, behind, or failing some invisible measure. It means you are noticing contrast, and contrast, when it's concentrated into a short period, can feel sharper than it deserves to. If this season feels uncomfortable, it's not because you're doing it wrong. It's because the season is designed around a specific experience, and not everyone is living that experience at the same time. That recognition matters. Not because it changes anything immediately, but because it removes the quiet self-blame that often settles in unnoticed. And once that blame is gone, the experience becomes easier to carry, not lighter, but more honestly placed. This is where we begin. What makes this time of year uniquely difficult isn't that it introduces something new into your life, it's that it concentrates something that's already there. Absence doesn't suddenly appear in December, distance doesn't begin now. The difference is that this season shines a very bright light on those realities and asks you to look at them all at once. For most of the year, people live inside varied rhythms. Some weeks are social, some are quiet, some are full, others sparse. There's movement between them, and that movement softens contrast. Being alone one weekend doesn't feel defining when the next week looks different. Absence remains part of life, but it isn't framed as the main event. This season collapses that variety, it compresses time, it takes what would normally be scattered across months and gathers it into a short, highly visible window. Plans cluster, traditions repeat, conversations converge around a single theme. And because everything is happening at once, difference becomes impossible to ignore. The environment reinforces this compression. Messages, images, conversations, expectations. They all point in the same direction. Togetherness is presented as the default. Family becomes the assumed backdrop. And even if you don't consciously compare yourself, the contrast forms anyway. It's not that you suddenly want something you've never wanted before. It's that what you don't have right now is being highlighted everywhere you look. And when absence is amplified like that, it can feel heavier than it actually is. What's important to understand is that this amplification isn't neutral. It doesn't simply reflect reality, it edits it. It takes a snapshot of a very specific moment and presents it as representative. A few days get treated as a measure. A single season starts to feel like a summary. That's why this period can distort perspective. Temporary situations begin to feel fixed. Circumstances shaped by timing start to look like permanent conditions, and what is simply true right now, being alone, being separate, being elsewhere, can start to feel like a statement about your life as a whole. This distortion doesn't happen because you're prone to negativity. It happens because human perception is sensitive to patterns. When a theme repeats loudly and consistently, the mind assumes it carries weight, and this season repeats the same theme everywhere. For someone whose children live far away, or whose closest relationships are elsewhere, that repetition lands differently. It doesn't evoke nostalgia or warmth. It highlights distance. It turns geography into absence, and it does so at the exact moment when that absence is least likely to change. There's also very little social language for this experience. The season isn't built to acknowledge people who are content with their lives but alone during this window. It doesn't offer a clear place for those who aren't grieving but aren't celebrating either. And when there's no role to occupy, people often assume they're failing to perform something correctly. This is where the sense of performativity comes in. When you're surrounded by an expectation you can't participate in fully, you're left with two options: withdraw or perform. And neither of those feels particularly satisfying. Withdrawal can feel isolating, performance can feel dishonest, and moving between the two requires energy that's already limited by the season's emotional density. None of this means the season is bad or wrong. It means it's narrow, it's designed around a specific configuration of relationships and proximity. When your life doesn't match that configuration in this moment, friction is inevitable. What you're responding to isn't a personal lack, it's a structural emphasis. The season magnifies togetherness, and in doing so, it magnifies whatever sits outside of it. Once you see that, the experience becomes easier to place. Not easier to enjoy, but easier to understand. The discomfort stops feeling like a verdict and starts feeling like a byproduct of context. This season isn't asking you to evaluate your life, it's simply reflecting one slice of it at high volume. And when that slice doesn't include what's being celebrated, the amplification can feel unfair, even if you know intellectually that it's temporary. Understanding this doesn't remove the loneliness, but it does remove the confusion around it. You're not reacting too strongly. You're reacting to an environment that's designed to emphasize exactly what you don't have access to right now. And that distinction matters, because once you recognize amplification for what it is, it stops masquerading as meaning. Once absence has been amplified, comparison tends to follow. Not because you're insecure and not because you're lacking perspective, but because comparison is a natural response to proximity. When you're surrounded by images and conversations that revolve around togetherness, it becomes difficult not to measure your own position against what you're seeing. This kind of comparison doesn't arrive loudly, it's subtle. You might notice it in small moments. When someone mentions plans you don't have, or when you see families moving together through spaces you're moving through alone. The feeling that follows isn't always resentment. Often, it's quieter than that. A flicker of jealousy, a pang of awareness, a sense of being on the outside of something that seems important to others. What makes this uncomfortable is that jealousy is rarely given a neutral explanation. It's usually framed as a moral failing, as ingratitude, bitterness, or envy. So when it appears even mildly, people tend to suppress it or judge themselves for it. But what's happening here isn't a flaw in character, it's a response to contrast. Jealousy in this context doesn't mean you want someone else's life, it means you're aware of a difference that matters in this moment. You're noticing that others are having an experience you are not. That awareness doesn't require desire or entitlement, it's simply recognition. The difficulty comes when that recognition gets turned into a verdict. When you start asking yourself why this affects you or why you can't just be happy for others without feeling anything else. Those questions assume there's something wrong with the feeling itself. But feelings that arise in response to comparison are not choices. They're signals of attention. And attention, in environments that emphasize sameness, naturally highlights difference. This is especially true when the difference involves closeness. Humans are relational by design. Not dependent, not incomplete. Relational. So when proximity is emphasized everywhere you look, distance becomes more noticeable, even if you've accepted it as part of your life. That's why comparison during this season can feel more personal than it actually is. The mind doesn't just register difference, it starts to assign meaning to it. It asks what this difference says about you, about your life, about your future, and those questions escalate the experience beyond its original scale. What began as a simple awareness becomes layered with interpretation. You're no longer just noticing that others are together, you're wondering what that means about you being alone. And because the season is framed as meaningful, the comparison feels heavier than it would at another time of year. This is where many people turn the experience inward unnecessarily. They assume the discomfort indicates something unresolved, or a need they've ignored, or a dissatisfaction they've been avoiding. But in most cases, that assumption isn't accurate. The feeling isn't pointing backward or forward, it's pointing outward at context. Comparison thrives in environments that offer a single, dominant narrative. And this season offers exactly that. It doesn't leave much room for variation. So when your life doesn't match the narrative, the difference stands out sharply. It's also worth noting that comparison doesn't disappear just because you intellectually reject it. You can fully understand that everyone's circumstances are different and still feel the sting of difference. Knowing better doesn't erase proximity. Awareness doesn't eliminate reaction. This is why telling yourself not to compare rarely works. It treats comparison as a choice rather than a response. And in doing so, it adds another layer of self-judgment to an experience that's already uncomfortable. What helps instead is accuracy, seeing the comparison for what it is, not a statement about your worth, not a sign that you want something you shouldn't want, just a byproduct of being surrounded by a single version of how this time is supposed to look. Once that's clear, the comparison loses some of its authority. It doesn't disappear, but it stops dominating the narrative. You no longer have to argue with it or correct it. You can recognize it as situational rather than personal. And that recognition creates a subtle shift. The feeling becomes less charged. It stops demanding explanation. It becomes part of the background, present but not central. This is the point where many people feel a small but important easing. Not because the season changes, but because the comparison is no longer being treated as a moral problem. You're not failing this season because you notice difference. You're responding to it. And that response doesn't say anything about the quality of your life or the direction it's moving in. It only says that right now you're aware of something you don't have access to, and that awareness, in this context, is entirely human. Once that's understood, the comparison stops being a trap. It becomes information. And information, when held without judgment, doesn't need to be fought. At a certain point, the discomfort stops being about loneliness or comparison and becomes something else entirely. It becomes fatigue. Not physical tiredness, but the exhaustion that comes from being surrounded by an experience you're expected to participate in emotionally, even when it doesn't reflect your reality. This is where many people begin to actively dislike this time of year. Not because they reject connection, but because the season demands a response that feels out of reach or dishonest. When celebration is framed as collective and automatic, those who cannot fully participate are left negotiating how much of themselves they're supposed to present. There is an unspoken expectation during this period to be visibly engaged, to sound warm, to appear settled, to mirror the tone of the season. And when that tone doesn't match what you're living, participation can start to feel like performance rather than presence. For people who are alone during this time, that performance takes effort. It requires managing reactions, smoothing over absences, offering explanations that aren't really explanations. It can mean pretending that distance doesn't register or that quiet doesn't weigh anything at all. Over time, that effort becomes draining. Not because you're incapable of warmth, but because warmth that isn't grounded in lived experience feels artificial. And maintaining something artificial, even gently, costs energy. This is an important distinction. Disliking the season doesn't mean you dislike joy, connection, or celebration. It means you're sensitive to the difference between what's being displayed and what's actually happening in your life right now. For some, that difference is small. For others, it's more pronounced. But in either case, the pressure to align emotionally with a narrative that doesn't include you creates friction. And friction, sustained over time, leads to withdrawal. That withdrawal often gets misinterpreted. From the outside, it can look like disengagement or bitterness. From the inside, it can feel like self-protection, a way of conserving energy in an environment that keeps reminding you of what you don't have access to. The problem isn't that you don't want to celebrate. It's that celebration has been narrowly defined. It's tied to proximity, gathering, and shared ritual. When those elements aren't present, the season doesn't offer an alternative way to participate honestly. So people adapt. Some keep a low profile. Some stay busy. Some lean into solitude. Others go through the motions quietly. None of these responses are wrong. They're attempts to navigate a situation that doesn't come with a script for anyone outside the central narrative. This is why the season can feel particularly alienating for those whose lives don't currently fit the expected shape. It doesn't just highlight absence, it asks you to respond to that absence in a socially acceptable way. And that's a difficult ask. It's also why forcing enthusiasm rarely works. It doesn't resolve the friction, it intensifies it. The gap between inner state and outer expression grows wider, not smaller. And maintaining that gap takes attention and energy. Many people in this position aren't looking for sympathy. They're not asking for the season to change. They just want the option to exist within it without having to perform an experience they're not having. Choosing not to perform is often mistaken for opting out of life. But that's not what's happening. It's opting out of pretense. It's a refusal, sometimes unconscious, to misrepresent your reality for the sake of alignment. This refusal doesn't make you difficult. It makes you honest. And honesty, in environments built around uniform expression, can feel isolating, but it also preserves something important. It prevents you from turning your own experience into something you need to manage or apologize for. There is a quiet dignity in not forcing yourself into a role that doesn't fit, in allowing the season to be what it is for you, even if that doesn't match how it's being framed elsewhere. That dignity often goes unrecognized because it doesn't look celebratory. It doesn't produce visible markers of participation, but it matters. It protects your sense of self from being shaped by a moment that doesn't represent the whole of your life. This is why disliking the season doesn't mean you're closed off or resistant. It means you're responding to an environment that prioritizes performance over nuance. And once you see that clearly, something shifts. The discomfort stops being something you need to justify. The withdrawal stops being something you need to correct. It becomes what it always was, a reasonable response to a narrow narrative. And from that place, the season loses some of its power to define you. One of the most subtle effects of this season is the way it alters the sense of time. A short period begins to feel larger than it is. A few days start to carry more meaning than they deserve. And experiences that are temporary take on the weight of something lasting. This doesn't happen because you're overthinking. It happens because the season compresses attention. So much emphasis is placed on a narrow window that it begins to feel representative even when it isn't. What is simply true right now starts to feel like a statement about how things are in general. When you are alone during this time, that compression can be especially strong. The absence you're aware of doesn't exist only in these days, but it becomes concentrated here. And because the season is framed as significant, the mind treats that concentration as meaningful rather than momentary. This is how a temporary situation can begin to feel definitive. Being alone right now quietly shifts into feeling alone in a larger sense. Distance in this moment begins to blur into distance as a condition. And even if you know logically that circumstances change, the feeling itself doesn't always respond to logic. The calendar plays a role in this. Certain dates are treated as markers. They're seen as checkpoints, pauses, or summaries. And when those markers arrive, people instinctively assess where they are in relation to them. Not consciously, but reflexively. This assessment doesn't need to be dramatic to have an effect. It can show up as a simple awareness that this year looks similar to the last, or different from what you imagined it might look like by now. That awareness isn't a conclusion, it's an observation. But observations, when repeated in a condensed period, can start to feel like judgments. What often goes unnoticed is that time doesn't actually behave the way these moments suggest. Lives don't unfold in seasonal units. Meaning doesn't accumulate evenly. Relationships expand and contract in rhythms that don't align with holidays or cultural milestones. But when a season is given symbolic weight, it can distort perception. It invites you to treat a snapshot as a summary, to read a moment as evidence. And when that moment doesn't reflect fullness or connection, it can quietly undermine your sense of where you stand. This is why the loneliness of this season can feel different from loneliness at other times. It's not just about being alone, it's about being alone during a moment that's been framed as significant. That framing adds pressure to the experience even when you don't agree with it. Over time, that pressure can turn inward. You may find yourself questioning whether this pattern says something about your life, your choices, or your future. Not because you believe it must, but because the season invites those questions without offering clear answers. The problem isn't that you're asking the questions, it's that the timing exaggerates their importance. A brief window is being asked to carry meaning it wasn't designed to hold. This is where proportion matters. Not as a mindset to adopt, but as a reality to recognize. A few days cannot accurately represent a life. A single season cannot define connection, fulfillment, or worth. And yet the structure of this period encourages you to treat it as if it can. Once you see that distortion at work, the experience shifts in scale. The feeling doesn't vanish, but it becomes bounded. It stops spreading outward into areas it doesn't belong. You can acknowledge that this moment is hard without assuming it's telling you something permanent. You can recognize the weight of the season without letting it stand in for a broader truth about your life. This doesn't require reassurance. It doesn't depend on optimism. It comes from understanding how time is being framed around you and how that framing affects perception. When the season passes, the compression releases, attention widens, the moment loses its intensity, and what felt heavy begins to return to its proper size without effort or intervention. That change doesn't happen because you made sense of anything. It happens because the conditions that magnified the feeling are no longer present. Knowing this doesn't remove the loneliness, it places it. It allows the experience to remain specific rather than expansive. And that specificity matters, because when a feeling is allowed to stay where it belongs in time, it stops acting like a verdict. It becomes what it always was, a response to a moment, not a measure of a life. By now, nothing needs to be explained further, not because everything has been resolved, but because the shape of this moment is clearer. What you're experiencing fits within the conditions of the season, the structure around it, and the position you find yourself in right now. There is no hidden meaning to extract from this, no lesson you're failing to learn, no emotional benchmark you're falling short of. This moment doesn't ask you to grow, transform, or reframe anything about yourself. It simply exists, and you exist within it. It's important to say this plainly. Your worth is not measured by how this season looks for you. It is not measured by who is sitting at your table, who is nearby, or who is elsewhere. It is not measured by whether your life aligns with a particular image at a particular time. A season cannot define a person. A calendar cannot evaluate a life. And a moment of absence cannot cancel years of connection, love, contribution, or meaning. Being alone during this time does not make you incomplete. It does not make you secondary. It does not place you behind anyone else. It simply means that the people who matter to you are not physically present right now. That fact carries weight, but it does not carry judgment. You are allowed to feel what you feel without defending it. You are allowed to dislike this time of year without believing that says something negative about you. You are allowed to move through these days quietly, without performance, without explanation, without needing to match the emotional volume around you. Nothing about your life needs to be proven here. This season passes the way all seasons do, not because time heals everything, but because circumstances shift. Distance changes, proximity returns in different forms, and moments that once felt heavy recede into their proper place. When that happens, this period will not stand as a summary of who you were or where you were headed. It will be one chapter among many, one that does not outweigh the rest. Until then, you don't need to carry yourself differently. You don't need to make this meaningful. You don't need to fill the space or explain it away. You are already enough within it. If this season feels quiet for you, that quiet does not diminish your value. If it feels lonely, that loneliness does not erase the life you've lived or the relationships that exist beyond this moment. If it feels heavy, that weight does not belong to you as a person. It belongs to the conditions around you. I see you in this. I see the steadiness it takes to move through a season that doesn't reflect your reality. I see the restraint in not forcing yourself into something that doesn't fit. And I see the strength in allowing this moment to be what it is without turning it into a judgment. You are worthy and valuable exactly as you are. Nothing about this time of year gets to decide that.